can affect them?
Well, it will inhibit their credit transactions. The dentist's office that will want to, they say mom will come in with a 10-year-old girl who will want to have braces on her teeth, and the dentist will say, my practice has been that you can pay me $70 a month until the braces are paid for, and they'll make that adaptation. I suppose it's a $4,000 or $5,000 ticket for a set of braces. It can be that. And now under this, the federal government will decide whether there's an interest rate, whether that interest rate will be an appropriate one, whether the terms are right. They'll simply be able to look into every single credit transaction in America. And I took, not all the language because there are almost 1,500 pages of it now, but I took a fair amount of it home with me over the weekend, and I read down through it to determine, can the federal government actually regulate an IOU that someone put into the pot in a poker game? And as I read that language, that answer comes back to yes. I don't know that they would, but that's how broad this language is. And then to make the determination on which businesses are too big to be allowed to fail, and have the federal government step in and decide that they have to be propped up or that they would be taken over into a federal receivership, then all it takes is substantial evidence that as determined by the Secretary of the Treasury, Tim Geithner, with the support of Ben Bernanke and Sheila Bair, to decide whether they want to take a business over or not. Now, I have long described the ruling three in America, President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and Harry Reid, as the ruling troika. They could go into a phone booth and decide what they wanted to do to America. Well, we have the ruling financial troika, the chair of FDIC, the chairman of the Fed, and the chairman of the Secretary of the Treasury. Those three make the decision on any business that they decide, whether it's going to succeed or fail.
Yeah.
And I think it's a tragedy that we could be to this point, that we could suspend our logic and our free enterprise system and hand it over to government regulators, especially those that really don't have much of a history in the free enterprise economy.
Yeah, and that's a great point. You know, you've got these businesses that are being, bailed out, and you're going to have government bureaucrats making the determination, not the free market, as to whether a business goes into bankruptcy, goes into receivership. It's amazing to give all that power to unelected individuals that nobody will know who they are. Nobody will know who's making these very important decisions about our economy. These are things that we should relegate to the free market. Now, to talk about a business that doesn't abide by the free market principles, Fannie and Freddie, they were ignored in this legislation. They weren't addressed in this legislation. As a matter of fact, the Senate's debating right now. Senator John McCain is going to push for an amendment to try and add language to address some of the problems in Fannie and Freddie. But it's amazing, and maybe you could talk about some of the problems and why is it being ignored in this bill. It's staggering that that business enterprise, which you have socialized losses, you can't lose money. The federal government will give you money. They're giving out multi-million-dollar bonuses to people that ran that business into the ground and maybe helped cause the meltdown, the financial meltdown we had in 2008. But they have privatized gains. So that's crony capitalism. It's a form of socialism. Yet, for whatever reason, nobody's addressing it in this bill.
Well, Brian, I see this come to me in my office here in Washington, D.C. Big businesses that part of their business model is to affect the change in legislation. And so they will set up a business model and they will start a business initiative, but part of their plan is to change the laws so that they can accommodate that and make a profit. And that's really what I described a little bit earlier that Fannie and Freddie did. When Acorn and other entities came in and lobbied that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac needed to have lower capital requirements than competing lending institutions and less regulation than those competing lending institutions. Now, when that happened, I remember an amendment that we brought to the floor, and it was October 26, 2005. It was offered by Congressman Jim Leach, former chairman of the Senate or the House Finance Committee, the Banking Committee, I think they called it then. And this amendment would have raised the capital requirements for Fannie and Freddie, raised the regulation requirements for Fannie and Freddie. I went down to support the bill. Barney Frank came and argued against that amendment vociferously. And in that debate, he said, anybody that's going to invest in Fannie and Freddie, do not do so believing that I will ever vote to bail out Fannie and Freddie. I will never do that. Well, and so there's that dialogue that took place, and it was part of the business model for some to lower those standards. But the lowering of standards that was there caused me to write legislation that I introduced in 2008, that would have privatized Fannie and Freddie and made them live underneath the same capital requirements and the same regulation requirements as the larger lending institutions that were there. But the implicit guarantee is the part that I think I left out. There was an implicit guarantee that Fannie and Freddie would be bailed out by the taxpayer. And look what's happened. Even though Barney Frank said no, he's been a complete participant in the following through on the implicit guarantee. And I'd make another point that sticks in my mind. It goes back at least 3 years ago at the beginning of the subprime mortgage debate or discussion that we had, as that began to percolate into the Wall Street Journal and other places. And I had one of the top, very experienced investment bankers as a guest for a breakfast that I host on Wednesday mornings at the Conservative Opportunity Society, which I chair. And this individual, since it's a private conversation, I won't relate his name, but he said to me, what you do when you're in this business, the large investment bank business, is pretty much what everybody else does. That way, if they're making money, you're making money, and if things fall apart and there's a bailout, you'll be bailed out with everybody else. That's the implicit guarantee that was for Fannie and Freddie, and even at that time, it was an implicit guarantee for the large investment banks that were now deemed too big to be allowed to fail, and I think should have been allowed to fail so that there would be no more implicit guarantee and there'd be more prudent decisions made with finances.
Now that's a point I'd like to expand on, the whole moral hazard of the federal government having this implicit guarantee and this new authority to provide bailout authority for the federal government. If the federal government has all this authority, it's going to promote businesses, especially businesses that know that they're going to be declared too big to fail, to engage in even more risky behavior, and that's going to be worse for the economy. One thing I found fascinating is the Special Inspector General of the TARP program has talked about how since the TARP program, all these businesses that were too big to fail, they're bigger now. So will that possibly happen if this bill is signed into law?
I think that the too big to fail piece of this and the guarantee, whether it's this bill actually writes the guarantee in.
Yeah.
And it says that Tim Geithner and Ben Bernanke and Sheila Baird make the decision on which businesses will go into receivership and which businesses will be propped up and taken over by the federal government and which will just simply be patted on the back and helped out. This is a dramatic departure from the free enterprise system. And it takes us to another place along on this scale that I'll just go through the litany of what's happened starting back at the end of the Bush administration. But all of this has been supported by President Obama or Senator Obama at the time. The takeover of 3 large investment banks and the federal government taking over AIG, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, General Motors, Chrysler, the student loan program in its entirety, the nationalization of our health care, which means our skin and everything inside it taken over by the federal government. By the way, if you go to a tanning salon, they're going to tax the outside of your skin, too.
Yeah.
And now we have the financial services of this, all financial credit transactions overseen, and many of them regulated by the federal government, the intimidation factor there, and then the implicit guarantee that you brought up, so distorts the free enterprise system. I don't know that we have a third of our former free market that's left again. And I'm very, very concerned about this whole race here. I don't know what they'll do next, but I have gone to the socialist website, I have read their playbook, and I have just given you the long list of what's on the socialist website. And so I think all I have to do is go read the playbook off the socialist website, Brian, and see what's left of the free enterprise market and see if we can save it. And then we've got to roll it back, and that's our job starting in November.
Well, I'd like to welcome Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann of Minnesota, a good fiscal conservative, and we've had a great discussion about the bailout bill, the financial services reform bill. And one thing that we talked about early on that I'd love for you to talk about is how is this going to affect the average American? I mean, this bill as a whole, it has a dramatic effect on our economy, but people listening in want to know, how's it going to affect me?
Well, it's a disaster, number one, bottom line, because it really gives the federal government the authority to decide who will get credit in the United States and who won't. Why is that the government's business? Why should they be allowed to decide if you're politically connected well enough or not, if you get credit? That's really a bad idea. The other thing that I think we have seen is I think every day we are happier and happier that we took the vote against